Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Those tuning in to our latest Hit It and Quit It, those celebrating Happy St. Patrick's Day. This is Brian Kozlowski, partner with Focus, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by my colleagues Melissa Hill and Liz Severance, as we're here to talk to you about leading in a hybrid environment, key learnings that we have acquired over what is really unbelievable to me, the last 3 years. I was reminded the other day that it's been just over 3 years, March 13th, the year 2020, when the world, at least certainly in the US, seemingly came to a grinding halt. And as I'll give credit to Keith, our esteemed managing partner, we all went into the office, we went home, and then we didn't go back. So we really covered a lot of ground in the last 3 years. And today we're here to talk about some of those things that we've learned and some of the data we've acquired, some of the learnings we have, and hopefully some of the stories that we can share with you as you think through your journey and continuing journey on this hybrid environment. So what are some of those things? Well, it's been really interesting, and we'll talk about 3 key elements. The first of which is this balance between team and organization. And Liz will walk us through that and some of the interesting data that we've acquired on that topic and some of the key learnings we've taken out of it. Managers have always been extremely important, never more so than in this hybrid environment. And Melissa will walk us through some of the balancing act that managers have had to do over the last 3 years, really understanding the needs of the organization and of their teams and being able to meet both stakeholders and really serving their needs. And then lastly, I'll speak to the talent gap and some of the research we've acquired and some of the things that we've seen as first think through succession and as they think through how to build an organization, how to develop an organization, and how to think about that next generation, that next evolution for their organizations. So we'll start with this team and organization affinity. And over the course of the pandemic, so over that last 3 years, we've had, as you can imagine, a lot of conversations with leaders around maintaining firm culture when employees are now in 2 dimensions versus 3 dimensions. And as you all know about Focus, culture is very near and dear to our hearts. And one interesting item that came up, and really supported by our research, which Liz will speak to, was around this idea of team and firm. So Liz, what did our research tell us on this topic?
Yeah, it's been interesting indeed. So I've been with Focus 16 years, and Focus has been doing surveys since they've started in the year 2000. And what we know is that organizations have both what we call a metaculture and microcultures. So they have an organizational culture, but different teams or different divisions, different parts of the business, different tenures or locations, they may have different values and behaviors from the overall organization that are important to them. And that's okay, as long as they don't conflict with the overall organization's culture and their values and behaviors. What makes them unique is important, and to honor that is very important, and to understand that. What our data tells us, though, since we've been working remotely and in a hybrid environment, is that the affinity to the team, what I call your immediate family, right, those microcultures, has gotten even stronger and tighter than we've ever seen it. And we know teams drive culture. So it's not surprising there's an affinity to the team. What is surprising, though, is how much stronger and tighter they've gotten and the impact on the overall organization affinity. And again, it's not surprising that we see this affinity to the team and the stronger affinity because, gosh, over the last 3 years, what we've gone through, it's been necessary to really rally around your team and to take care of your family. But what we also found in those surveys was that working effectively across the organization has gone down. Trust on the team stays high, but not across the organization. Communication is strong within teams, but not as much across the organization. And what we hear is that people are reporting that they don't really know, the vision or the strategy or the mission of the organization as well as they did before. They know what they have to do, right? They know what the goal of their team is, what their day-to-day work is, and what they're trying to achieve as their team. But how that connects to the overall mission or overall organizational strategy, that's where it's kind of lacking. And again, not surprising when we're not surrounded by the things that remind us on a day-to-day basis why we do what we do every day. We're not walking the halls, right? We're not bumping into our colleagues. We're not watching and listening and overhearing conversations. We're not at the water cooler. Who would have ever thought we would miss that water cooler, right? We're not doing any of those things. And those things remind us every day why we do what we do. So in the hybrid environment, it's extremely important for leaders and managers to reconnect people to the organization, right? And how do they do that? Because guess what, folks? Things are changing, but hybrid is here to stay in some form or another. So I think it boils down to three things. It boils down to communicate, model, and measure. So what do I mean by that? It sounds really simple, but again, not so much. So leaders and managers need to be communicating the strategy, the mission, the vision of the organization all the time. And we say this to leaders all the time when they are tired of hearing it, or when you're tired of saying it, people are just starting to hear it. So they need to be communicating that all the time. They need to help people connect the dots of what they do every day to the overall mission of the organization, the overall vision of the organization. How do what they do fit in to the entire organization? And they need to be able to help people see how the strategy of their teams fits into the strategy of the organization, the big picture. And they need to communicate in lots of different ways, because people hear things differently, depending on who they are, depending on what they're doing, depending on where they're located. So leaders need to be really armed with so many different tools of communicating to be able to get their message across. And so they need those tools and they need the skills on how to communicate, and boils down to kind of EQ, right? Knowing how to get your message heard. And then there's modeling, because what we know is that walking the talk matters. People respond to that. So organizations need to know and to know who they are, right? What are the values and behaviors at their organization? And they need to identify those. But beyond that, they need to also define those values and behaviors. What does it mean to be collaborative at our organization or to be accountable? Because the definitions are different in those microcultures. And so it is important to get those values and behaviors defined so we all know what it means to be collaborative at our organization or to be accountable. We need rules of the road, right? So everyone knows what is expected of them at the organization. And there is that, again, strengthening that affinity. And then you need to measure, because we know that the only way to know if people feel connected to your mission, vision, or values is to get feedback. We know that the only way to understand if the behaviors are being, done, if people are walking the talk, if those behaviors are getting ingrained, if people are following the rules of the road, is to get feedback. And it is the only way to know if you have both a strong team affinity and a strong organization affinity.
Great. So Liz, one follow-up question just on the measurement piece, because that's a question we often get a lot of, is how do you measure culture?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to measure culture, and we actually have a tool that does that. We measure not just culture, but organizational health, because it's extremely important that there's a variety of different things that can pose organizational affinity. As I mentioned, you got to be connected to the mission, right? Why you do what you do. You got to be connection to the vision of how you do what you do. And you have to know those rules of the road. So either by a big survey to measure the organizational health, but also you got to keep your pulse on this. So we really recommend you're not just measuring, once, twice a year or once every 2 years. You're actually measuring consistently so that you can keep your thumb on the pulse of what's happening in the organization. Takes 5 minutes. not even, to ask a few questions to see how your people are doing. And it's extremely important in this ever-changing environment.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. One of the word in following up on that, one of the words we've heard a lot over the last couple of years has been this word balance. And it's for managers, balance has really been critical, not only just in their personal lives. And I think, that whole work-life balance. And, we've kind of reframed that as flexibility in today's environment, but it's also this idea of balance and how they manage their teams. So, Melissa, what have managers told us about what they have faced in really trying to keep the scales balanced between the organization's needs and their individual teams' needs?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. They're actually telling us they're almost like an Oreo cookie, that they're the white stuff in the middle, because they really are having to meet two competing expectations. And I think this graphic says it all. What we're seeing is, believe this or not, almost half of companies' leadership are wanting people to return to work in person full time, versus 52% of employees want to stay hybrid or work remotely. So because policies such as attendance and coming into the office is set up in a leadership role, the managers are forced to be, having to manage their employees, their team members' expectations. So it's no wonder that over half of the managers are telling us that they feel leadership is actually out of touch with their employees. And they're also telling us that they don't have the influence or resources that they need to make changes on behalf of their team. So what's the solution? Well, in order for this new hybrid, work environment to work, the leadership needs to decentralize the decision-making and empower the managers to make changes on behalf of their teams. I think about this in terms of the football game, the Super Bowl. It's about who won the Super Bowl, but not necessarily how did we get there.
Interesting. So, I'd be interested to hear, we've had a lot of conversations with managers, certainly over the last 3 years. Can you share any insights from our work at, where a manager has effectively executed this balance between, getting outside of the stuffing in the Oreo cookie and balancing the scales of really effectively managing the organization's needs and the team's needs?
Mm-hmm. Well, one client that we're working with, it's interesting. They're now moving from a 1 day in the office or working remotely environment to now they want to do it to 3-2 in the office, or 3 in the office and 2 working from home. So personally, I've been coaching a manager of an IT department on how to do this transition. And I love that they're titrating, not going straight to 3-2. So what he did was he solicited input from his team. You have to give your employees a reason that they have to come back into the office. So what he did is he made very clear to the team the person or the need for in-person collaboration, and created team agreements around why, when, and how. So he got creative to create this balance that we're talking about. He's implementing no team meetings on Fridays, teams in the office on Tuesdays. And to be honest, it's still a work in progress. We're making tweaks, but the key takeaway here is the manager listened to the needs of his team, and he was empowered by leadership to make hybrid work work.
Thanks, Melissa. It's real interesting because it does lead into our next topic, which is mine on the talent gap. And when we look at managers and getting at bats as a manager, one of the things we've noticed is because we haven't been together, there haven't been opportunities to really learn how to be a manager. So, Liz, I'll turn it over to you as I talk about talent gap.
Yeah, I think, we've been doing a lot of work in the areas of succession, both equity and talent. And I think people would be really surprised at how the hybrid environment and the last 3 years have really impacted succession. So Brian, tell us how it has impacted, how this hybrid and remote work has really impacted the idea of succession, both in equity and talent.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in our rewards work, one of the things we've heard consistently, or at least certainly my 7 years with the firm, has been, professional development was one of the rewards that folks really sought out the most. And, in boutique, smaller organizations, that structure is a little bit harder. So now take that and take it to the second or third exponent of, well, we have a young employee base, or an employee base, doesn't necessarily mean young, and we're not all together. So I think back to my own personal career development, and I think back to when I was fresh out of school. And one of the ways I learned, and I think my fellow analysts learn, is we learn a lot by osmosis, which was we'd sit with senior partners, we'd sit with consultants that have been down the road before, and we just learn, and we'd make mistakes and be corrected, and we developed that way. We had this human interaction where we could ask a lot of questions. Well, that hasn't been there in the last 3 years. We haven't been in the office, we haven't been together, and we haven't had this opportunity to learn by osmosis, to really even think about learning and development very much at all. Because for the first 6, 8, 12 months, we were in a lot of kind of hand-to-hand combat. We were focused on just getting done what we needed to get done, and not really thinking about what the impact of that was going to be tomorrow. So now that we fast forward and have 3 years worth of data, what we found is, there's a cadre of members of teams who just haven't been developed. They haven't had that osmosis opportunity. They've learned or experienced a firm largely like we're talking today through Zoom. And even the best firms who have really thought through the process of leaving open Zoom lines and having those conversations, they've said, you know what, it just hasn't filled the gap completely. So from a talent succession perspective, what firms are finding as they look at their own data back in time is there's a gap that has to be made up. We have to really emphasize, now that we're getting back together, how we have to be much more intentional in how we develop people, from the analyst fresh out of school to one of our most senior folks, because along the way, everyone missed a little bit of something. And layer on top of that, you have a number of firms, largely, and a lot of founders who over the last couple of years have kind of reassessed where they are. And what they've said is, you know what, maybe I want to take a little bit of a step back. But when they're trying to take that step back, what they're finding is, well, is that next generation ready to step up? Are they in a spot, both financially, so that's the equity side, but more on the talent side, to take the reins of the organization? So founders are finding themselves in an interesting spot. They have the financial piece where they need to think through, but also as they think through the legacy, as they think through their clients, as they think through the health of their fellow employees in the firm, how are they going to move this forward? So what we're seeing is a lot of firms are really starting to double down and to really make talent development a key strategic point of where they want to be today, tomorrow, and moving forward, thinking through, where are our gaps? Where do we want to be organizationally? As I start to transition out, how do I impart what I know, my knowledge, onto that next generation below me? So this can be an ongoing entity. And it's certainly playing out across a number of our clients. And it's been interesting to see as they really wrestled with this idea of how do we sustain? How do we move forward? And where are those largest gaps, and how do we need to fill them?
Yeah, it's a big issue, right? And we've learned quite a bit. So as a wrap up, as you are leading in this hybrid environment, what do you need to pay attention to, leaders? You need to communicate, you need to model, and you need to measure. You need to communicate your vision, your mission, your strategy, and you need to communicate it, keep communicating it, and use a variety of modalities to do that so people hear your message. You need to have clear values and behaviors so that people know what is expected of them, good rules of the road, how everybody in the organization is going to operate. And then you need to measure so that you give and get feedback for your organization on how that's being done. You need to empower your managers. You need to make sure that they have the resources and the skills that they need to be leading their teams and to be helping the organization with their mission, vision, and their values. And then you got to be intentional about your development, not just your managers, not just your leaders, because they're dealing with so many things that are out of our control, but of the second generation and the third generation and the fourth generation, if you want a sustainable firm. You got to be intentional about those things. So thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure to be with you on a Friday afternoon. To hear this recording or any of our vlogs, you just visit our website, focuscgroup.com. You'll find things under our thoughts, and you can always reach out to any of us and Laura to get on our distribution list to make sure that you have access to those. Our next Hit It and Quit It in webinar is April 14th at noon Central. It is going to be about getting caught up in other people's drama. Drama's fun until it's not. So we'll be joining Keith Robinson for a discussion of how we get caught up in other people's drama. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a great weekend.